From the Buskirk Chumley Theater in Bloomington, Indiana, the Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs presents the 2010 Indiana 9th District Congressional Debate.
Welcome to Indiana's 9th District Congressional Debate. My name is David Reingold, and I am the Executive Associate Dean at Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs, IU School of Government and Public Policy. We are pleased to present these candidates and their viewpoints to the Bloomington and IU communities. Our moderator this evening is Brian DeLong, one of SPIA's newest faculty members. Brian brings 11 years of policy debate experience to SPIA. He has taught classes in public speaking, debate, and presidential rhetoric. Brian is also the coach of the IU debate team. He has coached 2 national collegiate debate championship teams, and I'm confident he will be an outstanding coach for IU as well. Brian?
Thank you, David. Good evening, everybody. The rules for tonight's debate are simple. During the hour-long debate, I will ask the panelists several questions. Each candidate will be provided with 1.5 minutes to respond to each question. Afterwards, the candidates are then allotted an additional 45 seconds for a rebuttal. During the debate, the audience before me has kindly agreed to be quiet, except for right now, as we honor our 3 candidates. Thank you, Representative Barron Hill, Todd Young, and Greg Knott for being with us today. The starting order for the debate has been randomly chosen. The first question will begin with Todd Young, followed by Barron Hill, concluding with Greg Knott. Your first question, Mr. Young. A recent Supreme Court decision increased legal rights of corporations to promote candidates during elections. What do you think this means for the health of American democracy?
Well, I actually think that recent Supreme Court decision was the right decision. I believe that corporations, like unions, do have the right of free speech, which is what was essentially determined in that decision. I think that all Americans should be afforded an opportunity to express their views and to use their own resources to get their opinions out about the issues of the day. I encourage every individual to express their thoughts on the issues of the day, whatever means they can, whether it's by coming to events like this and speaking to the candidates afterwards, whether it's by attending town hall meetings, or whether it's by purchasing television ads either on their own or through a corporate vehicle, be that a union or a corporate entity. So that is my thought, but ultimately I defer on these decisions to the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, they're the ones that determine what our law means. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Hill, what are your thoughts on the question?
Well, the Supreme Court sometimes gets it right, and sometimes they get it wrong. They got it wrong this time. These corporate dollars, these corporate and union dollars that are now spent for advertising campaigns are being spent right now as we speak. Some have been spent already in the 9th District against me, quite frankly. And, you know, the poor and the helpless can't compete against something like that. There's too much money in politics, way too much money. I've been doing this now for 10 years, and I know that there's too much money in politics. And this is another example of money pouring into political campaigns to influence decisions. Do we want oil companies and big energy companies controlling what the message is going to be on television all the time by providing them unlimited resources that they can use to try to persuade the public to vote one way or vote another way, while the common guy can't compete against that at all? And so I think it was a terrible decision that was made. It goes against every grain of American democracy in the last 100 years that we've been campaigning for office. And I'm very dismayed that this decision was made by the Supreme Court. I quite frankly think that Congress needs to act. And one of the things that we can do is make sure that before a corporation or a union, quite frankly, can spend unlimited resources, they had to get permission from the stockholders before they can use that money, because it's the profits from those stock makers that are actually being used to buy these television ads. So I think something like that would be appropriate, and if returned to Congress, I plan on introducing legislation to do just that.
Thank you, Representative Hill. Greg Knott.
Thank you, Brian, for moderating, and thank you, IU SPIA, for hosting this great debate. As a graduate of IU SPIA Bloomington, I'm honored to be a part of it. The Supreme Court did get this one wrong, and I agree with Congressman Baron Hill. It was wrongly decided, and we have too much corporate money influencing our elections. I'm the only candidate in this race to have signed the Fight Washington Corruption Pledge, and I would urge the other two candidates to sign as well. They can go to fightwashingtoncorruption.com. Many of the reforms that Congressman Hill referred to, such as shareholders giving permission to corporations to spend money, and the Fair Elections Act, and the Lobbying Reform Act, and overturning the Citizens United Supreme Court case, are all encompassed within the Fight Washington Corruption Pledge. I think all the candidates nationwide should sign on to it. There are over 200 candidates who have already signed on, and I challenge my opponents to join me in the Fight Washington Corruption Pledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. Next up is Todd Young with a 45-second rebuttal.
I actually don't see that there's a great deal of difference here between myself and the other candidates. I would be open to asking that the stockholders of a corporation or union members, before an ad is aired, receive their permission to use their resources to put an ad up. That strikes me as something maybe we ought to look at. I will say that Congressman Hill has never spoken out about this issue in the past, and he's received $1.8 million from union bosses over the years. 95% of our contributions come from private individuals in this campaign. Furthermore, corporations like General Electric, which own NBC, already have the ability to air ads in campaigns. This just levels the playing fields between different corporate entities.
Your rebuttal, Mr. Hill.
Well, there's nothing really to rebut here, other than the fact that I'm delighted to hear that Mr. Young does agree with my proposal to introduce legislation that would require corporations to get the permission from the stockholders before they can run these ads. Again, too much money in politics. Because of that, there's too much of an undue influence, especially by these corporations, and it was a terrible decision that was made. I wish Mr. Young would agree with that, but in light of the fact that he does agree with legislation I'm proposing, I'll leave it at that.
The final response.
Sunlight is a great disinfectant. We need to know where this money is coming from and who's affecting our elections. If Congressman Hill truly wants to propose this legislation in Congress, he should sign on to the Fight Washington Corruption Pledge that includes these reforms. I challenge both of you to do that.
Okay. Our second question for tonight is directed at Mr. Hill first. The question is the federal policy response to the foreclosure crisis appropriate in terms of scale, scope, and direction? Could the policies be improved?
Well, there's definitely a housing and mortgage problem in this country. There is no doubt about that. One of the reasons why we remain in tough times is because the housing market is not fully recovered. The federal government needs to do a better job, quite frankly, of overseeing this. But this has not happened overnight. The whole financial crisis occurred because of the housing market. What was happening was you were getting a mortgage, and then after you got the mortgage, then the banks and the loan companies would sell the mortgage to Wall Street. Wall Street would break it down then and sell it off in strips. People who had owned those investments didn't know if they were getting a good investment or a bad investment because they didn't know who was paying the mortgage on this. We soon learned that the housing market became a crisis because the loans that were being made were bad loans by many banking institutions in this country. And that slipped through the cracks over the last 10 years. And now we're trying to get back to a point where we can better monitor and regulate the housing market. And we passed a bill recently in Congress, the financial regulatory bill, that would try to crack down on some of these Las Vegas-style loans that they were making. So, Yes, it slipped through the crack over the last 10 years. We still have a problem. We're still working on it. And hopefully this bill that we passed in Congress will help us get to where we need to get as it relates to housing.
Thank you, Representative Hill. Mr. Knott?
Congressman Hill, you need to take accountability for your votes in Congress. One of those votes was to repeal the 1933 Banking Act, which Elizabeth Warren, among others, has suggested contributed to the too big to fail crisis. It stripped the separation between Wall Street banks and Main Street banks, between Wall Street casinos and Main Street lenders. This led to too big to fail, and it was the wrong solution for the voters of southern Indiana. The Democrats who voted against repeal only received half as much as the average Democrat who voted for repeal. That's a pay-to-play scheme, and it's wrong, and I hope that you will take accountability for your record. So I agree that the financial reform that was passed in the recent Congress was a step in the right direction, but it was actually written mostly by the banking industry, and it was watered down, and it had no teeth for derivatives or reforming Fannie and Freddie or many other things that it needed to do. And we need stronger regulation, not less, which you repealed in the Graham-Leach Act.
Thank you, Greg. Todd?
Well, like so many of these national issues, ultimate responsibility does rest at the feet of Congress. It was Congress that years ago passed a well-intentioned piece of legislation, like so many of them, the Community Reinvestment Act, that encouraged bankers and those making mortgages to make loans they might not otherwise make for the purpose of ensuring that more people could own houses. That's well-intentioned, but it had some unintended consequences. One of the things was these mortgages were then sold off from Wall Street bankers after they purchased them from banks to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, these government entities that all of us play a role in backstopping. And then when the house of cards came tumbling down, when many of these mortgages failed, all of us on Main Street were left holding the bag. So ladies and gentlemen, this Wall Street reform legislation, so-called, that Congressman Hill just referred to, did not reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac at all. It was an absolute lost opportunity, and they were one of the root causes of this financial crisis, which in turn infected the greater economy and has hurt millions of Americans across this country. So we need to go back to the table. We do need to reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that's something I'd like to be a part of.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Your 45-second response, Barron.
Yes, I didn't vote to bail out Wall Street. I thought that was a mistake. I can remember when the crisis hit. I had left Washington, D.C. to fly back here, landed, called back to talk to my staff to see what the latest was, and learned that this financial crisis was going on, that I was going to have to come back Monday to vote for a multi-billion-dollar bailout of Wall Street. And I told my staff at the time, I said, there is absolutely no way that I'm going to be voting for a multi-billion-dollar bill to bail out the banks and Wall Street. But in this last session of Congress, we did reform Wall Street. I think it was a real good bill. It addressed a lot of different issues, but the number one issue it addressed is that no longer can large banks are too big to fail. We have eliminated that possibility.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Greg?
Congressman Hill, you need to take responsibility for your vote to repeal the 1933 Banking Act. It led to the crisis that we're in right now. It led to too big to fail. Yes, I applaud you for getting on board with the No Bull platform, which is an acronym for my 6 signature issues, in being no bailouts ever, no business is too big to fail, and a true free market. However, by repealing the 1933 Banking Act, you led to too big to fail. And the reason many people think you voted for repeal is because you took over $800,000 from the banking industry. That's a pay-to-play scheme, and it's wrong. Thank you.
Your final response, Todd.
I'll just reinforce something I said before. Let's reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This is an abdication of congressional responsibility by not doing so.
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder, please keep the applause down to a minimum. To move on to the third question, it is directed towards Greg Knott. The third question is Do you support the extension of all of the Bush administration's tax cuts, or only those for the middle class? How would your policy affect the national debt?
Thank you for the question, but I would respectfully disagree with the wording. There is no such thing as a tax cut with borrowed money. It's not monopoly money, folks. We've got to quit pretending that because people are saying that it's a tax cut, but with borrowed money, that it's a true tax cut. It's actually a tax deferral, and we'll have to pay that all back with interest to China. That hurts our economic security, and it's wrong. It's the wrong policy for Southern Indiana. I disagree with that. I think that if we're going to have tax cuts, they need to be true tax cuts, and that includes spending cuts to pay for those tax cuts. I'm the only candidate up here who's proposed deep spending cuts in the right areas. That's our wasteful military spending. We spend as much as all the other countries in the world combined on our military. That's too much, and much of it is wasted protecting other countries overseas that should be paying for their own security. We have tens of thousands of troops in Japan, Germany, and Korea. They should pay for their own security. They're wealthy enough to, and we here in Southern Indiana shouldn't have to pay for that. So I'm for cutting where it needs to be cut. Another area that I would cut that my opponents have not agreed with is reforming agricultural subsidies. The top 10% of agribusiness gets 72% of the subsidies. That's Robin Hood in reverse, and it's wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. Mr. Young?
The last thing we need to do during the worst economy since the Great Depression is increase taxes. That's going to kill jobs, according to one latest study, kill 2,000 jobs here in the state of Indiana over the next 200 years, and also cut into over $700 million of Hoosier personal income. Ladies and gentlemen, this is ill-advised. Now, we can have an ideological debate at some point in the future once we pull out of this very tough economy. Mr. Hill will favor more spending and higher taxes. I will favor less spending and lower taxes. Let's at least agree to put that debate off until we pull out of this very down economy.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Representative?
Yes, I believe that we ought to extend the tax cuts for those people who make $250,000 and less. I think that's the way to go, because we do have a debt problem. And by extending it to the very wealthy of this country, you actually increase the deficit by about $70 billion. And so we got to get serious about the debt. And that's the reason why I introduced legislation to reinstate pay-go rules. Pay-go rules were in place in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president of the United States. Those pay-go rules actually led us to surpluses for 3 straight years. And then President Bush was elected, and he decided he wanted to cut the taxes that we're talking about here, and it led to record deficits as far as the eye could see. And so those pay-go rules were the instrument that disciplined Congress. And pay-go, all it is if you're going to spend extra money or you're going to cut taxes, you've got to figure out a way to pay for it. Well, I thought under the conditions that we were in with this economy a couple years ago that we ought to spend extra money and borrow it to try to get the economy going because we've lost jobs. But as a condition for that vote, I asked the president to help me pass those pay-go rules back in place again. And we did pass those pay-go rules back in place again. It is the law again, and it will lead us to a pathway of fiscal responsibility and will get us out of debt over a period of time.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Greg Knott, your 45-second rebuttal.
If we have pay-go and it's so great, why is 42 cents of every dollar we're spending this year borrowed money? We need a balanced budget amendment. That's the only way we can really fix it, to hold politicians accountable to stay within their budget. We can't afford to be wasting money overseas on the military and wasting money here at home on corporate welfare. We have to be honest about tax cuts. They're not really tax cuts if they're with borrowed money. Just because you go out and get a loan for a house doesn't mean you have all this free money. You owe it plus interest. Let's be honest about that. In my No Bull platform is lower the national debt. You can find more about it at nobullcongress.com.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. Todd?
We first need to pass a budget. For the first time since 1974, our current law dealing with budgets was passed that year. Our House of Representatives has failed to pass a budget during the worst economy since the Great Depression. when every family and every business across southern Indiana is setting priorities, it's time Washington set priorities as well. With respect to PAYGO, that is a ruse for spendthrift politicians. They just voted to pass the greatest expansion to our entitlement programs in modern history, and now we're talking about PAYGO. Baron Hill has voted to suspend the PAYGO rules 85% of the time. He'll do so in the future if you re-elect him.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Baron Hill.
There's a time and a place to suspend PAYGO, but I don't know where he's getting these facts there on 85 times. PAYGO is an important part of getting us out of debt. It worked in the 1990s. It has a proven record of working. I am glad and I'm proud of the fact that I introduced the piece of legislation and that was able to persuade my Democrat and Republican friends to vote for it as a way to get us on a pathway of fiscal responsibility. To say it's a ruse is just not true. There have been many things that we have done in Congress and have applied the PAYGO rules on a consistent basis. And I'm very proud of the fact that we had these rules back in place again, and I was instrumental in getting them passed.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. The next question is directed at Todd Young first. What would you do to reform Social Security to keep it viable for future generations?
First, let me set the stage here. Social Security is a sacred compact. We need to honor our commitments to today's seniors and those approaching retirement, ensure they get every cent they've been promised, because they don't have time to change their retirement expectations and change their saving patterns. For those who are my age, we are going to have to ensure that the program remains solvent because it's important. I will await, as will Congressman Hill, on record, to see what the President's Fiscal Responsibility Commission report says we should do to make this program solvent. It's going to require a bipartisan solution, and I want to work in a bipartisan way to make sure that this program remains solvent. But I'm optimistic. We've done this before. Back in 1983, the Greenspan Commission helped sustain Social Security and make it solvent for a longer period of time. So there's a precedent here. It can be done. Now, I will say there's some ads on the air that indicate I want to do something other than preserve Social Security for today's seniors. Those are false and without evidence. That's not my language. That is factcheck.org, a project of the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Center. In fact, Mr. Hill's entire campaign is based on false and misleading advertisements, and it's time to be called out by it.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Hill, please refrain from applause.
Thank you. The ads are not misleading, and if you listen very carefully to what Mr. Young is saying, he is saying that for those people 55 years of age and older, nothing changes. What happens to everybody that's 55 and younger? And that's where you need, I think, to pay attention. The facts is Mr. Young worked for the Heritage Foundation, which was a big advocate of privatization. I believe that Mr. Young is for privatization of those folks who are 55 years of age and younger. I don't think there's any question. I have signed a pledge saying that I will not privatize Social Security. Social Security is a sacred contract between the federal government and its people, for all of its people, not just those 55 years of age and older. And so I have signed a pledge here. I invite Mr. Young to sign the same pledge, saying that he won't privatize Social Security, because even if you do it for just those age 55 and older, you jeopardize the benefits for everybody who's 55 years of age and older, because you mess with the solvency of the fund. Now, Social Security has some problems, but they're problems that we can fix. And the commission that is meeting will offer its report in December, and I'm hoping that one of the suggestions that they make is to actually raise the cap of income that's taxed. Why should the very wealthy not pay Social Security tax and the rest of us have to? So I hope that's one of their suggestions.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Please refrain from applause. It's taking time away from the responses. Thank you. Greg Knott, your turn.
Thank you for the question about how we should best reform Social Security. It's actually part of my No Bull platform. You can find it at nobullcongress.com. We've already talked about N, which is no bailouts. O in the acronym is overhaul the tax system for job growth, simplicity, and fairness. The current system fails on all three counts. Now, how does tax reform relate to Social Security reform? and Medicare reform, which Medicare is actually the more pressing problem. Well, we used to have many, many more workers to support many fewer retirees. Now we're faced with a shrinking workforce to support an expanding retiree. Well, that's unsustainable, as you might guess. Well, we need to replace the funding mechanism, which is currently payroll taxes, and payroll taxes are also a drag on our economy and a job killer, and we need to replace that with the fair tax. What does the fair tax do? Unlike what Baron Hill might have you to believe in his ads, it's not an additional 23% sales tax on everything. Quite the contrary, it's actually a tax replacement. It replaces most federal level taxes with a border adjustable tax, which will create jobs. This shifts things to the general fund so that Social Security can be saved. I'll save for the rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. Todd Young, your rebuttal.
Well, I agree with Congressman Hill that Social Security does have problems. And the foremost problem is that members of Congress, including Congressman Hill, have for years raided the Social Security Trust Fund, transferred it to the general fund, and spent our retirement monies on everything but retirement. Ladies and gentlemen, that's wrong. As for privatization, there's only one person here that has gone on record for privatization. That's Congressman Hill. He has an election season conversion, but for those who are interested, check out a YouTube video. You can go to youtube.com and see Congressman Hill say that he's open to taking your payroll tax contributions for Social Security and having the government invest them in the stock market.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Hill?
I am not for privatization. I am for increasing the yield on what we invest in the Social Security trust funds. But let's clear it up right now. Here's the pledge. I've signed it. I will not privatize Social Security. I invite you to sign it as well.
Let's have a meeting where we trade pledges on various matters, Mr. Hill.
Well, let's start with this one. Let's start with this one.
Mr. Hill?
No, I've got the time.
Yeah.
I've got the time.
Let's schedule that meeting.
Right here's the pledge.
Schedule that meeting.
Would you be willing to sign the pledge?
Please. Greg Knott, your final response. Oh, wait. All right, our fifth question.
I get the rebuttal.
Greg Knott, yes, your final rebuttal. Thank you.
I wish I had known that Congressman Hill wasn't going to abide by our pledge not to use props. I'd have brought my own. I think both candidates really need to both of my opponents, the Washington insiders, need to come clean on their position on this issue and not hide behind a blue ribbon panel that's appointed. You should have a leadership role. If you're elected to Congress, we're sending you there to take a leadership role, and you should come out on your position, not the blue ribbon panel's position. Mr. Young, if you're for privatization, you should say that. Mr. Hill, if you're for saving Social Security, you should give us a plan like I have.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Just one more reminder, please refrain from applause. We only have so many questions to get through. The longer it takes us to get through, the less responses we can get from our candidates. Thank you. All right. The fifth question tonight will begin with Baron Hill. Your question: what are your plans for placing Indiana in a leadership position to counter global climate change?
Well, that's a very good question. I've spent a lot of time on the Energy and Commerce Committee working on legislation that I believe does a great deal of work of cleaning up our environment and making us energy independent and creating jobs. The energy bill that we passed out of the House of Representatives unfortunately did not make it through the Senate. But it was a bill that, when it originally started, was a bill that I could not support because it unfairly taxed ratepayers in southern Indiana and other rural districts. So I went to work on the committee and convinced the committee to change the bill so that it would not have an adverse effect on ratepayers in southern Indiana. The bill does three things. It reduces the carbon emissions into our atmosphere, which we need to do because it is causing global warming. And I think there's some differences about whether or not that in fact is among my opponents. Number two, it creates jobs. There was one study that showed in Indiana alone it would create 30,000 jobs. And number three, it makes us energy independent. It gets us on that pathway. And so it does a lot of things that are good for our environment and for our people and for our air that we breathe. It's a bill that I proudly supported. I don't know where Greg is on it, but I know Todd is adamantly opposed to that bill because he believes it would have increased rates, but it would not have increased rates in southern Indiana. And proof of that is Duke Energy endorsed the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Greg?
Well, Congressman Hill, I'm glad you asked where I stand. I would have voted with your Democratic colleague, Brad Ellsworth. He voted against it because it's a job killer for Indiana. And I think this is not the time to be killing jobs when our unemployment rate is above 9.5%, as it has been for the last 14 months. There is much disagreement within the scientific community as to whether the climate change we are experiencing is man-made or not. And I would encourage everyone here, along with my opponents, to watch both sides of the issue as I have. I've watched both The Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore and the BBC documentary called A Global Warming Swindle. There's much debate to be had on this subject, but assuming, if we can for a moment, that the global climate change we are experiencing is man-made and it's not a natural fluctuation as we saw in the medieval warming period, anything we do about it has to include the biggest emitters in the developing countries. That's China, that's India, Brazil, Russia. All these emerging markets have to be brought in to a voluntary agreement as they tried to do in Kyoto and they tried to do in Europe, and it failed. Mr. Hill's cap and tax system, it has a mechanism to penalize those countries if they don't comply, but it would start a trade war, which would again kill jobs. I'm opposed to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. Mr. Young?
With respect to the science of global climate change, I know there are people of goodwill, intelligent people that I respect on both sides of this issue. I'll continue to learn more about the science and follow those debates as they play out. But I will say, even if we accept the worst premises of those who believe that climate change is a man-caused problem primarily and that it needs to be addressed, this is not the solution. The Wall Street Journal has indicated this cap-and-trade energy tax is likely to be the largest tax increase in American history. Now, here in the state of Indiana, 95% of our electric power is generated through combustion of coal, 95%. And it was President Obama himself during the 2008 elections who said that this cap-and-trade energy tax would bankrupt coal-fired power plants. That's going to increase the cost of business in places like Indiana. We'll see jobs migrate to the coast and especially overseas. It's going to hurt businesses and consumers alike. An increase of 26% for gasoline, 60% for our electric power, 79% for natural gas, and kill over 43,000 jobs here in the state of Indiana. On a per capita basis, this will more adversely impact the state of Indiana than any state in the country, and Barron Hill voted for it.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Your 45-second rebuttal, Mr. Hill.
The science is overwhelming. There is no question that man is contributing to climate change. No question about it. The science is overwhelming. Look, folks, this is God's green earth, and we ought to respect it. And we ought to do what's right for our environment. And this bill is what's right for our environment. It is God's green earth, and we ought to protect it. For years, we've tried to pass legislation, and the special interests always bottled up, year in and year out. If this is so bad, why did Ronald Reagan himself do the same thing with sulfur when he was President of the United States? Same cap-and-trade bill. No difference, same bill. And so this is not what people have portrayed it to be. It's the special interest, again, using their money influence to make sure that their interests are protected and not our environment.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Mr. Knott.
Congressman Hill, I agree that we must protect our environment. In fact, my concentration at IUSP was environmental science. I just don't think this particular piece of legislation accomplishes that goal. And I would have sided with your Democratic colleague, Brad Ellsworth, in defeating this legislation instead of what you did, which was side with big business. Duke Energy, as you know, was promoting this legislation for their own special interest. I wish you would have sided with Indiana employees and not voted for this job-killing legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. Mr. Young, your final response.
This legislation, best estimate is that it changes global temperatures by 0.05 degrees Celsius. It's a unilateral solution to what may well be a global challenge. Let's analyze what will happen should this come up next year and pass both houses of Congress and be signed by President Obama. We'll increase the cost of business here in places like Indiana. Jobs will migrate overseas. Places like China will have to build their own power plants in order to sustain those jobs, and those power plants are dirtier and less efficient than our own. We single-handedly kill over 40,000 Hoosier jobs and make the environment dirtier in the process. Really bad piece of legislation. For those who are wrestling with the science, I understand that. It can be very confusing. Go to the Cato Institute website, a listing of scientists who say it is not settled.
Thank you. Your time is done. Okay. For our sixth question, it is directed to Greg Knott. The question is, for years there has been discussion about the don't ask, don't tell policy. Do you advocate this policy?
Don't ask, don't tell. It sounded good at the time, didn't it? Unfortunately, the military didn't keep up their end of the bargain. They didn't implement it correctly. We were told that the military would be able to respect people's views while they were off base. If they wanted to attend like a gay rights rally when they were off duty, that would have been okay. And then they could come back to base and serve honorably. Unfortunately, the military has not kept their word, and they have instead looked at people's private emails and gone on witch hunts to try and root out homosexuals that are actually serving our country very honorably. We need Arabic translators in the wars that we are fighting. They're kicking out homosexual Arabic translators, and not because they're openly gay or hurting their mission. Quite to the contrary. The reviews of their performance have actually been very high. It's only because of this failed policy. I would immediately end it. I wish President Obama would end it through executive order. I hope the courts overturn it, and I hope our congresspeople will pass legislation to end this failed policy.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. Mr. Young?
Call me old-fashioned and Midwestern, but I don't think it's good manners for anyone, heterosexual or homosexual, to discuss their sexual activities in the workplace. So that's where I start with this position. Now, I've actually served in the military. I spent a decade in the military between being enlisted in the Navy for a year, attending the U.S. Naval Academy, and spending 5 years on active duty in the U.S. Marine Corps. I served during the time that this don't ask, don't tell policy was implemented. At the time, we'll recall, no one was happy with it. But I can say that on balance, and there have been some implementation issues that need to be mended, but I think we should not end this policy implemented by President Clinton. It's on balance worked. It has been a compromise, and it's one that should continue. Let's remember the rationale. The rationale at the time, according to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President himself, was that our military is primarily a fighting force, and that military morale and readiness are preeminent. Those are the main concerns. We were told that it might undermine military readiness and morale to allow gays to openly serve in the military. I left the military 10 years ago. It's hard for me to see how things have changed so dramatically in the military culture that we can now change this policy. Like all these issues, I remain open to more information. I think we'd be well served with a congressman who approaches these things with a measure of humility. But for right now, I haven't heard enough to convince me that we have to end this policy.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Barron?
It needs to end. I voted to repeal it, and given the chance again, I'll vote to repeal it as well. Men and women serving in the Army who are willing to put their lives on the line in patriotic service should not be discriminated under any kind of circumstances along these personal choices that we make. It's just plain wrong, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Your final your rebuttal, Greg. 45 seconds.
Yes, again, it's not a horrible policy in concept, but the military has failed to implement it fairly. They've gone on witch hunts and searched people's private emails to try and prove that they were homosexuals. Mr. Young, I applaud your military service and I thank you for it, but I would respectfully disagree and say that this don't ask, don't tell policy is the wrong policy. And if I were out there, and one of the guys serving next to me was a homosexual, but he was doing a great job, I would feel less safe on the battlefield if the military arbitrarily removed him for his sexual orientation. I think that's the wrong policy.
Thank you, Greg. Todd?
Nothing further on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hill?
Yeah, once again, I voted to repeal it. We'll do it again. I do want to return to a question about China on the energy bill, however. You know, one of the provisions of the bill that we passed was it allowed for the United States to actually impose sanctions upon China if they didn't upgrade their facilities, utility facilities. Right now, there's no weapon that we can use in order to get them to comply with emission standards. This bill actually created a way for us to do that. And so that's another reason why I voted for the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. For our seventh and final question, it is directed towards Todd Young. Due to time issues, we will reduce the first speech down to 1 minute with 30-second rebuttals. Your seventh question, should the United States stay the course in Afghanistan? What would your exit strategy be?
Stay the course is certainly not what I would characterize as what our policy needs to be. The mission needs to be clarified. It is opaque and murky right now, and I fault members of Congress for not asking tough questions on this. It was even Colin Powell, the general with so many years of experience, who was on Meet the Press recently, and he said it was very difficult for him to determine whether we're actually winning or not. That's the fault of our policymakers for not establishing or requiring the generals to establish very clear benchmarks towards success. Finally, I would say that this arbitrary timeline we've established for pulling our troops out, a political timeline essentially, is ill-advised. Instead, if we're going to be there, we need to be there to win. Otherwise, that hurts the morale of our troops that we've asked to go into harm's way, and it's unfair to the American people. So I will push for those policy changes, but ultimately, this is a training ground for terrorist activity, and we need to ensure that it doesn't remain a training ground for terrorist activity so that we keep the American people safe.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Representative Hill.
Well, I had some real reservations about what the president wanted to do when he wanted to do the surge in Afghanistan, so I went there myself in February of this year to see for myself if this was something that we should be doing. One of the encouraging things that I learned was we also went into Pakistan and had the opportunity to meet with the Pakistani Army generals. There has been no question that a cozy relationship has been developed between the Pakistani Army and the Taliban, and so I wanted to hear their point of view. I came away convinced that because the Taliban had almost captured Islamabad, that the Pakistani Army was now ready to fight the Taliban, and without their help, we would not be willing to do it. The president kept his word in Iraq, and I think he's going to keep his word when it comes to Afghanistan. The mission is this: to diminish the ability of the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to inflict another wound like 9/11. That's the mission. Right now, we're not there yet, but with our mission over there, we'll get it done.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Mr. Knott.
We've come back again to the No Bull platform found at nobullcongress.com. B is bring the troops home and invest in our economic security and education. I would cut wasteful military spending and invest it in K-12 scholarships so that we can graduate not 3 out of every 4 high school students, but every high school student so that they're prepared for the workforce in college. Afghanistan in particular is a very difficult case because we're not at war with Afghanistan or its people or, for that matter, its corrupt dictator Karzai. In fact, we're at war with a small group, by our CIA's own estimate, under 100 Al-Qaeda members that can't easily be found. Occupying an entire country with a heavy footprint is the wrong policy. What we did at first when we came in with a small force of special forces and CIA and air power was the most successful thing we've done in Afghanistan yet, and that's the policy.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. 30 seconds, please.
All I can say is that this is the most important decision members of Congress must ever make. Whether that we, number one, commit our men and women into harm's way, and number two, how we continue to engage in these different conflicts. So it's something I'll take very seriously. I will ask probing questions. That's my chief criticism of our current majority in Congress, is they haven't asked enough questions with respect to this matter. And that's all I have on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Hill.
Yeah, this is tough sledding. There's no question about it. It's a messy situation in Afghanistan, but it's something I believe that we can do. And I trust the president's word that he will start bringing these troops home beginning next year. He kept his word in Iraq, and I believe that he will keep his word in Afghanistan. But we are making progress towards the mission. We are working with the Pakistani Army. I think we should continue to do that. But I don't think there's any question that we all want to bring our men and women home from these areas. And one of the ways we do that in the future is lessen our dependence upon foreign oil.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Greg Knott.
It's not monopoly money, folks. We got to pay the piper sometime. What did it cost us to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan? 2 undeclared wars of choice promoted by Dick Cheney and rubber stamped by Congressman Hill. Well, according to researchers at Harvard and Columbia, $61,000 per household is the total long-term cost when you factor in long-term medical costs for our men and women in service and everything else. It was the wrong policy.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Mr. Hill, you're up first. As a retired educator, there are approximately 5 different insurance vendors competing for my business, offering many different premium costs for the service. How does this competition for customers represent governmental takeover of healthcare? 1 minute, no rebuttal.
Well, the bill that we passed that I proudly supported was not a government takeover. It was insurance reform, actually. But one thing it does do, pre-existing conditions are no longer in existence with this bill. Children right now can get insurance if they have a pre-existing condition. The donut hole goes away for senior citizens. There is a tax cut for small businesses in this health care bill. And if you're a young student and you're graduating from college and you're having a little trouble getting a job, guess what? You can stay on your parents' insurance policy until you're age 26. These are good things. The Mayo Clinic, who has the best health care in this country at the lowest cost, says that this bill that we pass is a step in the right direction to reform our medical situation as it exists in America today. And I proudly stand before you to say, I'm glad I voted for the bill. It's a good bill.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Please. Greg, you have 1 minute, no rebuttal.
What's the first thing you do when you find yourself in a hole? Stop digging. L in the no bull platform is lower the national debt. What Congressman Hill voted for didn't address the major problem, and that is the cost of health care. I think a much better plan was called the Healthy Americans Act, which was a bipartisan proposal that would have brought down the cost. Instead, we ended up with a monstrosity that doesn't lower the cost and adds to the national debt. That's not right. That's not the right policy. What could we have done differently in addition to the Healthy American Plan? Well, one reform that I would favor is being able to buy health insurance across state lines. I know where I work, we can only get it from Anthem and SciHo. That's not a free market, folks. That's one step removed from a monopoly, and it drives up cost. We need common sense reforms, not big government takeovers.
Thank you, Mr. Knott. Todd Young.
I applauded the fact that we were approaching health care reform and taking it seriously. This is a genuine issue as we compete for jobs in this global economy. Health care costs skyrocketing, businesses, families, and individuals struggling to meet the costs, and frankly, it does undermine our ability to attract jobs. Unfortunately, this piece of legislation does nothing to address cost. It establishes a new entitlement program subsidizing individuals to go out and purchase insurance, and it vastly expands an existing one in Medicaid. It actually increases cost. It increases cost, according to the Obama administration, by $300 billion. We can expect health care premiums to shoot up 111% over the next decade. Without this legislation, only 79%. How is this thing all paid for? Well, we cut $500 billion from our seniors' Medicare. $500 billion, and enacted a slew of new taxes that are just going to kill jobs during the worst economy since the Great Depression. It's bad legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Young. That marks, please, we only have so much time. That marks the end of our questions segment. We now transition to the closing statements. Baron Hill, you're first for 2 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity, as we all do, to present ourselves before the people of the 9th District in Indiana. 2 years ago, after the election, I was summoned back to Washington, D.C. for emergency meetings. At these meetings, we had economists from all over America warning us that if Congress did not act, we were looking at a depression, not a deep recession, but a depression, with unemployment rates at least 16%, perhaps 25 to 30%. That's what we were faced 2 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, an economic crisis like we haven't had since the Great Depression. These economists said, go to work, try to get this economy revived. So we did. We passed a stimulus package. We passed cash for clunkers to trade in old cars for new cars. We passed a bill that would create opportunities for new homeowner buyers through tax credits. We saved the automobile industry. And the automobile industry in Indiana hires as many people, almost as much of people in Michigan. We're second to Michigan in the number of jobs. Think how many jobs would have been lost had we not helped out the automobile industry. And we all did it by ourselves without a whole lot of bipartisan support. That's what we did. And instead of unemployment being 15 to 20 to 25%, it's now at 9.2% in the 9th District. Still way too high, but a lot better off than had we not done anything. So the choice in this election is, do we want to continue the progress that we've made by voting on policies that stopped this crisis in its tracks, or do we want to go back to the old ways of the George Bush era? I don't want to go back to the old ways of the George Bush era. I want to keep moving forward. And if you elect me to Congress, I'll continue to fight for the people of Southern Indiana and this country, and we'll continue the policies that have got us out of this mess in the first place. Thank you, and we appreciate the opportunity to present ourselves.
Thank you, Baron Hill. Todd Young, your final statement, please.
Nearly 2 years ago, worried about the fate of this country, and after much consultation with friends and family, I decided to run for Congress. So I hopped in my Jeep and began this long journey. Since then, I've traveled all across this district. I've been from New Albany to Napoleon, from Rockport to Rising Sun, from Batesville back home to Bloomington, usually by myself. Now, I recognized before long, after consulting with so many people, that I wasn't really alone. It wasn't just Todd Young running for Congress. I'm just one of so many Hoosiers who are concerned about the direction of this country, all the spending, all the debt, and who wants to do their part to try and make a difference. I've seen and heard them at town halls, around kitchen tables, at 4th of July parades, at fall festivals, and everywhere in between. This is their campaign. During a town hall in New Albany, I met Carol Green. Now, Carol traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. to visit with Congressman Hill and express her very deep concerns about this health care legislation. She was summarily told to go about her way, kicked out of the office, and sent home. This is Carol's campaign.
Please.
In Lawrenceburg, I met Chick Hyde, an 86-year-old veteran of World War II. Now, Chick is very concerned about this spending, and he's gotten directly involved in this campaign as a volunteer. This is Chick's campaign. This campaign belongs to all of those people and so many others. It belongs to the countless common-sense Hoosiers who are genuinely concerned about the future of this fine nation, who oppose Washington's reckless tax and spend ways, and who refuse to let America drift into a less prosperous, less powerful power. That's right. Our current congressman has advanced all these policies, ladies and gentlemen. They're ill-advised. This is our campaign. This is our congressional office, and together we're going to take it back. You have this Marine's word on it.
Thank you, Todd Young. Please, Greg Knott. Greg Knott. Greg Knott is our finalist. Your final statement, please.
By now, you all know me as Greg No Bull Knott, running on the No Bull platform found at nobullcongress.com. My solutions are nonpartisan, and I will work with any representative from any party to get things done. However, I will also be the pimple on the backside of anyone who stands in the way of reform. Why not elect Todd Young? Well, his election would empower Boehner as Speaker, Joe, I'm sorry, BP Barton as Chair, and the failed Cheney-Bush policies of the past. The Louisville Courier-Journal also reports that deputy prosecutor is not the most accurate way to describe Mr. Young's profession. He's a private practice lawyer. Don't we have 235 of those already in Congress? Are you seeing the results you want yet, folks? I think we'd rather have an IT professional from a small business and an entrepreneur and a Washington outsider to bring the change you want. Why not Barron Hill? Well, he took his chief of staff, Ryan Guthrie, and they went to work for a Washington lobbying firm. Today, the Indiana Daily Student reported that they took $30,000 in that lobbying firm as fees, and then when Congressman Hill was reelected the following year to Congress, he gave that same client $390,000 taxpayer-funded earmark. That's a pay-to-play scheme, and it's wrong. I would fight, if elected to Congress, to do the Lobbyist Reform Act so that make sure that that never happens again. Mr. Hill called for an apology from me. Well, you won't get it, sir. And in addition, I call for your immediate resignation. and withdraw from this race.
Thank you. That marks the end of tonight's debate. I would like to thank our candidates. For taking time out of your busy schedules in what was surely a lively debate. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the League of Women Voters, the staff of the Buskirk-Chumley Theater, the staff and the members of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, and the debate team for making this possible. Don't forget to vote on November 2nd. Please drive home safely. Good night and good luck.